Diolch yn fawr iawn i chi gyd. Prynhawn da pawb, a chroeso i'r Coleg Brenhinol Cerdd a Drama Cymru, prynhawn yma, i'r datganiad Opera Rara, Coleg a Canwr y Byd, Cardiff BBEC. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this recital, this slightly changed recital, as you'll all be aware, due to the fact that Julian Gonzalez is indisposed, he's unwell, so unable to perform today. This is a partnership between the college, one of our industry partners, Opera Rara, and BBC Cardiff Singer of the World, these recitals. I spoke a little bit about the relationship between Opera Rara and the college yesterday, talking about the fact that we house the Foyle Opera Rara collection here, which is a great resource for our students in their pursuit of bel canto, particularly less well-known or undiscovered bel canto. Other ways in which we work together with Opera Rara are the Janet Price Opera Prize, which is a competition we run here at the college for first-year students on the opera school. Linked to that now is a relationship with Opera Rara in that the winner of that competition also receives a recital in London linked with Opera Rara. So it's just great ways in which we're able to work together to discover more about this golden age of opera. As you'll be aware, today's recital is now more of a discussion between Roger Parker, who is musicologist and repertoire consultant for Opera Rara, and Opera Rara's chief executive, Henry Little, just talking about the methodology of restoring lost and forgotten operas, this operatic archaeology that goes on. And I'm delighted that Kezia Bienek, who performed in yesterday's recital, was able to stay on and will be illustrating the talk, together with our newly announced music director of the David Seligman Opera School, James Southall, on the piano, as he was here performing yesterday. So it's going to be a fascinating recital this afternoon, so please give a very warm welcome to Henry Little and Roger Parker. Diolch.
Welcome, everyone. It's a great pleasure for Opera Rara to be here this lunchtime at the Royal Welsh College of Music and Drama at this event in association with BBC Cardiff Singer of the World. And it's a special pleasure to introduce Opera Rara to you. Opera Rara's mission is to rediscover, restore, perform, and promote the lost operatic heritage of the 19th and early 20th Italian and French opera. And it's an exercise that we have been doing for some time. We're 50 years old. We were founded in 1970. And I like to describe our mission, and you'll hear me say this phrase quite a bit over the next hour or so, as a journey of live operatic archaeology. Just in the last year, our recent projects include 3 recordings, 2 operas by, two Italian operas, one by Donizetti, L'esule di Roma, which we did very recently, last month, in a studio recording and then performed at London's Cadogan Hall. And the year before that, a rediscovery by Saverio Mercadante, a wonderful piece called Il Proscritto, which we performed 1 year earlier and was released a few months ago. And alongside that, to give you an illustration of the range of work, we also did a wonderful neglected operetta by Offenbach called La Princesse de Trebizond. So that just gives you a flavor. But now I'm joined by our repertoire consultant, Roger Parker. So Roger, tell us a little bit about the Opera Rara story. How did it all start?
Yeah, it started with a Texan called Patrick Schmid, who's kind of become legendary as the first artistic director of Opera Rara. And he was he was in America in the 1960s, became obsessed with bel canto opera, and decided he was going to come to Europe to get to know more about it. The mysterious thing is he seemed to get immediately involved with James Southall. Don't know how he did that quite. That's remained somewhat mysterious. But he did get in touch with James Southall, and she acted as his mentor in some ways and encouraged him to start. It was just at that period where there were all sorts of operas being rediscovered in this repertory. And he and a colleague called Don White got together and started producing, finding out the manuscripts of these operas, creating editions, and giving concerts of them in the early 1970s. And then what happened was they realized that when they did these concerts, there were bootleg recording people coming in and recording it and then putting it out on bootleg labels. And they suddenly thought, well, let's cut out the middleman here, let's cut out the pirate and release our own recordings. And so in 1977, they started producing their own recordings. And their idea at the beginning was to record the complete operas of Donizetti. A not modest ambition. There's about 70 of them. And they did quite a lot of them, and then they spread into other repertory there. But Patrick Schmidt was a legendary figure, and I could have one brief anecdote about him. I was involved in the complete Donizetti edition, which was being published by Ricordi, and everyone said very quickly, look, you've got to get in touch with Patrick Schmidt because he knows everything about Donizetti. And I thought, yeah, he may not know some of the things we've discovered, you know, and so on. So I rang him up one day, and I thought I'd impress him. We were doing Maria Stuarda, and I'd found what I thought was a completely unknown autograph fragment which had been buried in some library in Naples. And I thought I'd open with that, and I said, well, you may not know that there's this new autograph fragment in a Naples archive, and over the phone, he sang it back to me. I mean, and I thought, my God, he didn't even know I was going to be talking about Maria Stuarda. He's got all this stuff in his mind. It was, he was an incredible character.
And tell us about your first project with Opera Rara, Roger. What was it?
The first one that I was really closely involved with was Les Martyrs, which is a French grand opera based on his Italian opera Polluto. And it was a student of mine at Cambridge called Flora Wilson, who's now a musicologist and also a broadcaster. Probably some of you have heard of her, who did the edition of it. And then Mark Elder was the conductor, and Michael Spires was involved in it, and Joyce L. Curry, a lot of people who became very closely involved in the Opera Rara project. And it was an incredible sort of voyage of discovery, actually, doing that. And it's something I remember right from the very beginning of creating the edition to then sort of supervising Flora's work, and then to see it gradually come to life was an enormously memorable occasion for me. I mean, musicologists don't often get the opportunity to do that, to study work in a detail like that, which can sometimes be rather dry and uninteresting, but then to see it gradually, for text to become act, if you want, you know, for the text to be recreated by the greatest artists. It was an amazing experience.
Fantastic. And part of the purpose in these lunchtime concerts during this Cardiff Singer of the World Week at the college is about promoting the Foyle Opera Rara collection. For those of you who don't know, the Opera Rara collection was probably one of the largest collections of 19th century operatic material, mainly focused on Italian but also French repertoire, which of course was built up over many decades by Patrick Schmidt and is now resident at the college. Roger, tell us a little bit about the collection. What does it consist of, and what for you makes it special and unique?
Yeah, I mean, Patrick had access to quite a lot of funds through supporters of Opera Rara, and basically at a time in the 1970s and 1980s, there were enormous amounts of manuscript material and early printed material in Italy, which were going for sale. And I think the best way of describing Patrick's sort of collecting mania was hoovering, really. I mean, he just wanted everything he could possibly buy about a very specific kind of music, which was mostly operatic music of a distinct time period. So we've got a collection here which has some ordinary things in it, but an enormous number of things which are just completely unknown elsewhere. It's an extraordinarily rich collection if you're interested in this particular period. So it's a remarkable resource, actually, which I think, I mean, Patrick didn't, you know, there was so much that he collected that I'm not sure he knew exactly what he had. So there's still a process of discovery going on now here in Cardiff to understand what is there in that collection. I just spent the last 2 mornings in there and finding things that I didn't know existed. And, you know, I've been living with that collection for a long time. It's inexhaustible.
It's amazing. It really is a gift that keeps on giving, isn't it?
Yeah.
Shall we listen to our first piece of music now? I'd like to introduce James Southall, who is Director of Music at the David Seligman Opera School, who's going to join us at the piano. So welcome, James.
I should say before, just to introduce this, what James has very kindly done is he's created a couple of songs without words here. There are songs that were going to be performed to you by the tenor who's indisposed, and James has sort of created piano versions of it. This first one is very simple. It's about someone who's rowing his boat, as people do in Italy, and a tear is falling from his face because his lover, his beloved, fell into the water and drowned. And you'll know immediately when there's a discussion of the lover falling into the water, there's a very dramatic moment of piano illustration. That could be Mendelssohn, couldn't it, almost? Yeah. It could be a song without words. Yeah. It's very, once you haven't got the Italian language there, you notice the kind of Europeanness of the language. Yeah.
Brilliant. So let's talk a little bit about Gaetano Donizetti. Donizetti is, in very many ways, Opera Rara's house composer. Roger told you just a few minutes ago that he wrote roughly 77 operas, depending on how you analyze the various versions. If there are more of those, it gets maybe into the early hundreds. We've recorded 27 of them. Tell us why you think he's such an important figure in Opera Rara's work.
Yeah, well, I mean, partly I think it's because you know, when Patrick started this in the 1970s, how many Donizetti operas were known? You know, maybe 5 or 6. You know, the repertory pieces, L'Elisir d'Amore, Don Pasquale, Lucia di Lammermoor, you know, a few others. It has gradually become clear, I think, over the years that they're not the famous ones because they're better than the others. They were just by accident, you know, they ended up to be like that. And actually, there's a process of discovery there. I mean, Donizetti is, I think, a fascinating figure in some ways because he begins at a period where Rossini was dominating everything, and his early operas very reminiscent of Rossini. But very soon after that, he began experimenting, became a self-consciously romantic composer, sort of rejecting this Rossinian aesthetic, did a whole number of experimental works, then sort of broke into an international career in the 1830s, and then in the last years of his life, in the 1840s, was based in Paris and essentially became a Parisian composer and took on all the kind of colors and harmonies of the French language. So there's an enormous trajectory which he followed there, and a sort of breadth of musical imagination, which is really quite extraordinary. I mean, I think one of the things that's increasingly becoming obvious as we get to know all these Donizetti operas closely is the influence that he was on Verdi and the next generation. He was enormously influential in that way. Even down to later operas of Verdi's like Aida, you see all sorts of ways in which Rossini was the kind of dominant force. I'm sorry, I'm being attacked by an.
I think it's Donizetti reincarnated.
It's Donizetti saying, "No, you're wrong. You're wrong." But yeah, the sheer variety, you know, of Donizetti's musical imagination means that we keep coming back to it and finding new pieces to do.
It's very interesting, isn't it? Because of course, Opera Rara's work is all about the past. It's all about the past made new. And actually, how does that journey of rediscovery, how does it bring fresh, new light, new perspectives on Donizetti's work that perhaps weren't there before?
Yeah, I think there are all sorts of ways in which one of those, if you just know Donizetti through the famous titles, then you don't know what's special to that title or what's part of his general musical language. There are all sorts of ways in which each new opera sort of creates its own dramatic world and then reveals something new about all the other works that we know. I mean, I think the last couple of operas that we've done, Il Paria and then L'Esole di Roma, have taught me, and I've been my whole life really working on Donizetti, taught me new things about him, new ways in which music history can be written slightly differently because of knowing about these operas. So there's a tremendous kind of, I think the astronomers talk about a parallactic effect, you know, where one planet comes into contact with a lot of other planets and everything is altered. All the positions are altered around it. And that's what happens when you discover one of these unknown Donizetti operas, that all your knowledge of all the others changes in some mysterious way.
It's really, really interesting.
Have we got, is it more music?
I think it's time for our first song, yes.
I think there's the first song I mentioned, Donizetti spent his last years in Paris, and this is an example of one of the Parisian songs. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece, which he eventually reused in La Fille du Régiment. But you'll see, I mean, what's astonishing about this is the modernity of the language. You know, I would say, I mean, see what you feel, but it's almost like this could be, you'd guess the composer was Bizet or something like that. It's an enormously, from his early Rossini beginnings, it's a real difference. So anyway, here to sing it is Kezia
Bienek. Please welcome her.
I hope she's there.
She is there. Kezia.
Pitié de moi, je te
Really wonderful music, and we'll talk a little bit more about where that material comes from a little bit later. But for now, Roger, let's just talk a little bit more about what I described earlier as this journey of live operatic archaeology. Tell us a little bit about how that works. What are the stages? How do we go from finding a manuscript in a library somewhere in Italy or wherever to the point where we have a completely finished score and we make a studio recording and perform it in concert?
Yeah. I think someone who's W.H. Auden said it's easy to ask the hard question, you know. It's a tremendously difficult process, actually. And I think one of the reasons for this, I often think of this, and it gives me some sort of confidence. Verdi, who knew a thing or two about writing operas, said once to a librettist, a good librettist needs to know when not to write poetry. And he added, and a good opera composer needs to know when not to write music. And I think what he meant by that is that in any opera that's going to work dramatically, it needs to leave space for drama to appear. There is such a thing as an opera which can be too beautiful musically or be too complex in terms of its libretto psychology. Opera needs to be simple and needs to leave space for dramatic effect to happen. But how do you realize that? You know, one of the problems is if you've just got an orchestral score, and it's probably very difficult to read anyway, but you know, you can work out how it's going to sound. But if it's all beautiful music, that's not necessarily going to make a beautiful opera. So it's a tremendously difficult thing. And usually what happens, there's a sort of backwards and forwards. I mean, in recent times, as Henry said, we did this Mercadante opera, Il Proscritto. It's completely unknown. It was performed in Naples in 1842, and that was the end of it. It was never seen anywhere again. All that remains is the autograph score. And it was Carlo Rizzi, in fact, who first suggested this opera. And then the ball came into my court, and I looked at it, and I thought, yeah, okay, possible. And then it went back into his court, and he thought, yes, I've looked some more at it. And we gradually went, you know, backwards and forwards, and Henry and the rest of the Opera Rara team become involved in this. And gradually we kind of creep towards a consensus about it, because it's a tremendously delicate thing, and we don't want to spend, you know, an enormous amount of time and money doing this, only for people to say, yeah, but wasn't that interesting? We have to be sure. And it was very interesting with Il Proscritto. What I think convinced everyone is that Carlo took the trouble to perform one of the arias, and he recorded his performance, just a piano performance of one of the arias. And he said, look, this is really good, you know. And we listened to this, and in the end, it convinced us that this can make sense dramatically. But it's an enormously complicated decision and a difficult one to make, and it requires a whole number of people thinking about it, and thinking about it from a libretto point of view, from a musical point of view, from the vocal point of view. It's enormously complicated. And
of course, casting is a real challenge, because unlike most opera houses doing a standard repertoire of, say, 20 titles, we're working with something completely new. We've got to find different reference points, haven't we? How do we go about that, Roger?
Yeah, it's enormously difficult, because singers' lives these days are basically, you know, for them to learn a new part is an investment. It's an investment of time.
Sure.
And very often singers towards the end of their, I mean, there are some famous singers that we all know who sing literally dozens of parts and keep discovering new parts. But there are many very famous singers who carry on singing the same 8 or 10 roles. And they can make ready money doing that, you know, so why do they need to? So you have to find singers who are interested in new repertory and who are going to take the same kind of risk that we are. You know, is this going to work for them? And that process of persuading them that they can contribute to this is an enormously important part of that. And that has to come, we have to make the whole edition, you know, before that happens. So, yeah, it's quite a late stage, but an important one.
And of course, I think the attraction, one of the reasons why singers come to us is because of the opportunity to make a recording, isn't it? And
Yeah.
the idea is that there is some legacy, something is left behind. A performance is relatively a more transitory experience, but with a recording, something is there forever.
Yeah, and as we all know, the great age of studio recordings of opera has gone now. It won't come back again. But it's interesting. I quite often do this radio program on a Saturday morning at the BBC called Building a Library. I'm actually doing one this weekend, I think, again. I hope I am, yeah. But it's deciding on what's the best recording of a given opera. And it's extraordinary the number of times you actually come back to something that was done in the 1970s or 1980s because it's a studio recording, you know, because they took the time to make it as good as possible. And the fact that we do studio recordings is, for the singers, an enormous attraction now because it hardly ever exists elsewhere.
Shall we listen to our next piece of music now? Do you want to tell us about it, Roger?
James is going to play a piece which I call Erwartung. It's about expectation. It's a lover who, it's a tenor lover, who is anticipating the moment when he will see his beloved again. And it's a tremendous, what is it, James? It's agitated music.
Yeah, very, agitated and excited, I suppose, generally. Yeah.
And imagine the singer sort of spitting out these words, and then these sudden vocal climaxes. Erwartung, that's what it's called. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, the
Thank you.
the last piece was Mendelssohn. That piece was Liszt, wasn't it? That was Liszt.
Like it, yeah.
Definitely, yeah.
Wonderful, thank you, James.
Pleasure.
So all of the music that you're hearing today actually is not part of Donizetti's operatic output. It's actually part of his song output. Parallel with these 70 or 100, depending how you look at it, operas, there is also a further roughly 160 to 200 songs. And so, Roger, tell us a little bit about Donizetti's songs and how many are well known, how many are completely unknown, and why is it an attractive area of repertoire for Opera Rara to be exploring?
Yeah, this was my lockdown project, basically. I thought someone's got to do something with these songs. There are 200, solo songs and another 50 duets and all sorts of other things. He was enormously prolific, and he wrote these throughout his life, these songs. And the interesting thing about them, I think, in all sorts of ways, is that they're not much like his operas. Songs are very different in all sorts of ways. They have to make their little world in a much briefer time. An opera aria is going to last 5 minutes. These songs mostly last 1 minute or 2 minutes. So that's one thing. Another thing about them which is fascinating is that they, and as James's sort of solos there demonstrate, they relate Donizetti to the European tradition much more. You know, they could be like Liszt, they could be like Bizet, whatever. There's all sorts of ways that some of them could be like Schubert as well. There's all sorts of crossovers. So it's a way, again, of this kind of parallactic effect of understanding something more about the composer by thinking about these songs. But I mean, one of the things that this Donizetti song project is bigger than, we are going to do recordings of them all, and that's 8 CDs, and we have a connection with the Italian publisher Ricordi, and they will be publishing all the songs. So there's a huge kind of legacy there. But I think one of the things that's become clear to us is that what we want to do with this also is to make it a larger enterprise in some ways. And it was very interesting in that way what kind of educational function this repertory can have. And I had a very interesting conversation with James. I'd like to sort of bring him in here because as an educator, here at the Conservatory, you were talking about this. I mean, say something about that.
Yes, I think, we have this fantastic resource in the college here, and I think we would like to really encourage the singers throughout the college, of which there are more than 100 first study singers, to really delve into some of this untapped repertoire. It's a real treasure trove, and what you get from just doing a song in miniature. I was chatting to Kezia about it the other day. She started, whilst she was at college, exploring the songs of Verdi, just a few songs, but she felt that it was a real gateway into singing some of the operatic roles. So I think, these, as Roger's just said, these dramas in miniature, they are real little scenes. I mean, the next, we're doing a piece later that's almost sort of, it's a song plus, it's got a whole dramatic scena around it. I'm sure Roger will give more detail about that later, but you can see how that would really help to bridge the gap between song, it's all the same tools, it's the same toolkit that you'll use as a singer of this song repertoire that you will on the big stage singing operatic roles. So as you get a lot of Schumann and Schubert and Mendelssohn and so on in recitals here, but you get the occasional Bellini song, but that's, maybe the odd, maybe 1 or 2 Rossini songs, but there's so much good music. And I think that we'd really like to encourage all of our singers to find this music, and it hasn't got the weight of recorded history with it, so I think that can be quite refreshing and liberating in lots of ways for young performers.
I was wondering about that. Henry asked me a question earlier, which I didn't answer fully. I mean, how many of these songs are known? Of these 200 solo songs, I would say about 20 are quite well known,
Yeah.
and you'll find them on YouTube, multiple performances. About another 50 are maybe performed once in the 20th century. The other 120 are just completely unknown, have never been performed since the 19th century. And I wonder whether, in some senses, that's a good experience for young singers to say, right, here's a song, and no, it's not on Spotify or on YouTube. I've got to make sense of it myself. Actually, it could be...
Absolutely, yeah.
Could be valuable for them. So we're thinking of this. I don't know, I'm playing with this idea that, you know, one thing that could be great is here to have a Donizetti song competition for students, you know. And they can have one of our recordings as a first prize or something, you know. But just the educational experience of doing this, of making this repertory something larger than just the recordings and just the editions would be really valuable.
So this is going to be our focus really over the next 2 years. Well, in between, I would say, the small matter of recording the original 1857 version of Simon Boccanegra, which we're doing next year. But other than that, we will be focusing very much on the songs. And as Roger says, you know, it's not just about recordings with major artists. There are opportunities for us to work with artists like Kezia, with many up-and-coming, very talented artists, some of whom will be singing with us for the first time. So we're very excited about the opportunities that this rediscovery of Donizetti songs offers us. So we're now building, I think, towards our great finale, which is a particular Donizetti song, which yesterday, actually, Roger, I thought you very aptly described as perhaps less of a song and more actually as a kind of dramatic cantata. So introduce that and tell us about it.
Yeah, this is an extraordinary song, written again in Donizetti's French years. It's the most daring harmonic thing he ever did. But just play us a little, the beginning of the... You know, I mean, that's all the chromatic notes are sounded in the first 3 chords. It's an extraordinary opening. This is a depiction of a woman who is being called mad, and she is on St. Helena Island with Napoleon, and is obviously obsessed with Napoleon, who is there in exile. And her sort of project is that what she imagines she's going to do is help him escape. So she keeps having these sort of moments where she says, yes, everything's ready, we can go off together, you know, and escape from the island. And then she has these sort of visions of him staring out of the sea and stuff like that. And then towards the end of the song, the Dies Irae sounds, and the mood gets more and more serious. And it's clear that the emperor has died and that this is not going to happen anymore. And she's left absolutely desolate at the end of this. Her plan to help him escape has been thwarted by his death. So it's a real, you know, it's a sort of interior monologue that's going on in a woman's mind. And it's called La Folle. And let's welcome Kezia to sing it.
disent tous que je suis folle. Et que me fait le mépris des pervers.